Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sunny Simon, and I'm so glad to welcome you to our COVID's Impact on Sports program on behalf of the Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County. A special welcome to the new faces joining us today. Our Federation Live virtual programs are among the many ways we are reaching out to bring our Jewish community together, as we also work to meet the rising critical needs of our people here in Israel and beyond. And welcome to Giving Tuesday. We are offering today's programs in observance of this important international time to heal, help, and bring hope to those less fortunate. Through our annual campaign, our Federation's funding for more than 70 partner agencies here in Israel and around the world enables us to respond immediately in times like these. With our vital support, our agencies on the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis are able to continue, adapt, and increase their care for those most vulnerable in the face of unprecedented challenges. After our program, we'll email you some information about how to learn more about us, along with more great virtual opportunities to connect. Before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, your microphone is muted now for the presentation, but you will have the ability to ask questions during Q&A time afterward. In addition, you can adjust the way your screen appears. If you'd like to view the person who is speaking or asking the question, please select Speaker View at the top of your Zoom screen. Now, it is my privilege to introduce our presenter, Jeremy Mark Peltz. Jeremy Mark Peltz, or JMP, as he's known to most family, friends, and listeners, has been a host at ESPN West Palm, 106.3 FM, since 2010, and he also serves as the station's content director. You can hear JMP Thursday night at 6 p.m. on ESPN West Palm tonight, as well as contributing on air or behind the scenes to shape the rest of the content for ESPN 106.3. He also does play-by-play for Kaiser University football and Nova Southeastern basketball. JMP grew up in Miami and attended Temple Beth Am and graduated and Temple Beth Or during much of his childhood. He graduated from the University of Miami in 2005 and wanted to be in sports for much of his life, and quickly realized that would have to be behind the microphone since he had no athletic skills to speak of. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, Sonny, and thanks to all of you for joining. And you may hear either my dog Smokey or Zoe being co-host of this presentation, depending on how loud they are in terms of barking. So May 11th, 2020, the day the sports world changed forever. And I used the word change. I didn't say stopped, because sports doesn't stop. Even if live events stop, what we talk about in sports doesn't stop. That's something that we preach a lot about at ESPN West Palm, the station that I work at, is there's always something going on in the world of sports and beyond. And I didn't say the day the sports world died. We're not using that word. This is the last time you're going to hear me use that word, because we're sports, we're fun, we're the diversion away from the real world. And while we're going to talk about the impact of COVID-19, we're going to, in a lot of ways, talk about sports as being the escape from the real world, which is why so many of you consume sports. So up until March 11th, sports had mirrored society. We knew about the coronavirus. We knew that it had impacted China and impacted other countries, and that it was making its way onto landfall here. And as the days grew closer, the more and more it was part of the everyday conversation, and the more and more it was in the news. But I mean, what fun is it talking about how the coronavirus would affect sports? Because up to that point, it really hadn't affected sports. There was a lot of speculation as to how it was going to affect sports, but don't tell us how it's going to change sports until it actually changes sports. So why preview what the coronavirus might do when we can talk about filling out our March Madness brackets, about who our team's going to pick in the NFL draft, about where Tom Brady's going to go in free agency, about baseball and whether the Yankees have a chance to win the World Series, the azaleas and the smell of the Masters, which was just over a month away from that point. And even in the days leading up to March 11th, 2020, when coronavirus intersected with sports, sometimes we didn't understand the grasp of it. For example, a few days before that, the NCAA made the decision that they weren't going to allow the fans in the upcoming NCAA tournament. There was a certain sports talk host in West Palm Beach that criticized the NCAA, said it was an overreaction, said, why can't we just go week by week on this thing? That idiot was me, by the way. But the point being, I, like most of you sports fans, were probably ignorant of the situation and the change that was about to engulf us. But on March 11th, and specifically the night of March 11th, and it's a day that many of you on this presentation, sports fans, are probably going to remember. The sports world changed forever. It changed because of the name Rudy Gobert. Now, whether, Rudy Gobert is somebody that you probably don't know who he is unless you are a diehard NBA fan. If you're a casual fan, maybe you know who he is. He's an all-star center on the Utah Jazz, but he's not LeBron James or Kevin Durant or Kawhi Leonard or Dwayne Wade. And if you're, not a big basketball fan, you don't know who he is, but you know him as the first active player who tested positive for COVID-19. And all of a sudden, it was like reality smacked us in the face. You had an active player in one of the major sports in America that had the coronavirus. This was right around the time that Tom Hanks said that he had the coronavirus, and you had a couple of other celebrities. But for sports, the Tom Hanks was Rudy Gobert. And that night, we were in the middle of an NBA game. It was the Utah Jazz against the Oklahoma City Thunder, when all of a sudden that news came down and the game was postponed. Every other game that night was canceled. And then slowly, with the NBA on hiatus, everybody else followed. Those seemingly now ignorant comments that I made about the NCAA tournament. And why won't they let fans watch it? Well, fans would be watching an empty stadium because there were no NCAA tournament games. Then spring sports in college all went away. Spring training ended in Major League Baseball. Opening day wasn't going to be in the beginning of April. Golf tournaments. You weren't going to get the Masters in April. You weren't going to get the US Open in June. You weren't going to get the PGA Championship in May. You weren't going to get the British Open, period. Wimbledon, out the door. Soccer, which is a growing sport, obviously, in this country, whether it was MLS, whether it was the Premier League overseas, whether it was the Champions League, that was on hiatus. So everything changed. And we probably didn't get the play-by-play of what had changed and didn't think about it so much as sports fans because, the focus for a couple of weeks was less about sports and more about us understanding the realities of the situation and what we were going through and learning terms like social distancing and quarantine and 6 feet apart. And, we may have missed sports, but that probably wasn't the prevalent thing on our minds, even if you were in the industry. The right way to say it is that we were processing the change. So March was the time of change. Then March goes into April. And as normal can be during these times, your routines of working from home or virtual happy hours or how you were socializing not in person, as much as those became as normal as they can be, Well, we started to notice more that not only had sports changed, not only was there a void, but we needed sports. So then that goes to the next keyword that I'm going to use, and that's the word nostalgia. Nostalgia is a good word for everybody. It's a good word for sports fans. And we've had a lot of fun with nostalgia. You may not have live sports, but I mean, hell, we just celebrated the 100th year of the NFL. Got 100 years of football games that you can relive. We may not have opening day in baseball, but you got classic games. If you're a Marlins fan, which, I'm probably talking to about 3 people, but you remember the 1997 World Series, back when the Marlins were a great team. You may remember Edgar Renteria singling up the middle like it happened yesterday. You got a chance to actually see it in living color. An event that happened 23 years ago. More recently, you're a Miami Heat fan, you fondly remember the days of LeBron James taking his talents to South Beach and teaming up with Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh, and what it looked like when the championship went through Miami every single year. Got to see those games. Golf fans, whether it was last year, Tiger Woods climbing the mountain back to glory in the Masters, or yesteryear moments like, seeing the 1986 Masters on TV with Jack Nicklaus from our own backyard, probably the most memorable tournament that we've had in the last 30, 40 years. You got to see these events and relive these events and relive the memories that you may have of these events, whether it was with your parents, whether it was with your spouse, whether it was with your children. So you had some nostalgia to fall back on. And then came the real dose of nostalgia. And it's ironic because he's been the savior and the icon of sports now for the last 35 years. And of course, I'm talking about Michael Jordan, his airness. When Michael Jordan entered the NBA, he immediately transcended the NBA. He helped save the NBA, him, Larry Bird, and Magic Johnson. I mean, you're an NBA fan now, and think about the fact that, we talk about these games that were on, on TV back then. Before Michael Jordan, you had NBA Finals games that were actually on tape delay. That would be shown at 11:30 at night because CBS wanted to show reruns of Dallas. True story. That went away with MJ and Bird and Magic. And you had this documentary that for the past 3 years ESPN had worked on, with all this footage that was going to go to waste, that they finally got permission from Michael Jordan to use all this footage from the Chicago Bulls last championship season, where you got to see Michael Jordan in the flesh. You got to see unfiltered Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, Phil Jackson, and the last season of maybe the greatest dynasty we remember in sports. The Last Dance documentary on ESPN, which, as I understand, we've got 4 episodes to go. They still haven't finished putting it together, but they were supposed to run this documentary as complimentary programming to the NBA Finals in June, and they pushed it up. And so what has part of the sports conversation been the last 3 weeks? It's been Michael Jordan. Here he is again. And Michael Jordan and this documentary is the perfect intersection of several different generations that are probably watching me talk right now. If you're part of Generation X, if you're a baby boomer, nobody was better than MJ. You're probably the person sitting there laughing at the way that basketball is played now compared to the rough and tumble days of the 80s and 90s with the bad boy Detroit Pistons and the Pat Riley New York Knicks and how flagrant fouls in today that would result in suspensions, back then were not even fouls. And you're laughing at the idea that a LeBron James could be as good as Michael Jordan. And this documentary is giving you confirmation of that. My generation, I'm 36, I'll be 37 in June. I missed the beginning of Michael's prime, but I watched him in the 90s. And one of the things to me that made Michael the greatest ever was that he is the only athlete that I saw then. And I remember this as a 13, 14-year-old kid, that if Michael Jordan was playing in an important game, they were not going to lose. The Chicago Bulls were not going to lose when Michael Jordan was playing in an important game. No matter what the situation was, no matter how many holes of golf he may have played the night before, or how late he was, gambling or partying, or that he shot 6 for 30 the first 3 quarters, that Michael Jordan and his just insane competitiveness and persona and skills were not going to let the Chicago Bulls lose. That was my memory when I was 13 or 14. And 99 times out of 100, what I remember when I'm 13 and 14 as a sports fan is kind of different when I'm in my 30s and you actually see the real thing play out. Well, this documentary for me and many others reminded us that I was right when I was 13 or 14 years old, because Michael Jordan just did not lose. And that's why, to me, he's the greatest of all time. And then the generation after me, the millennials, those that are in their 20s, teens, that you didn't see Michael Jordan. You saw Michael Jordan highlights. For you, LeBron James is your Michael Jordan. Dwayne Wade is your Michael Jordan. Kobe Bryant, may he rest in peace, is your Michael Jordan. And you're getting the best sports education that you could get. And so this nostalgic period, while what's happening on the outside may not be fun, while it may not be the most fun replacement for live sports, it's always fun to look back at nostalgia. So now let's go to a word as we move towards the end of April. A word I actually haven't mentioned that much in sports, and that is football. Big, beefy football. No one is going to take our football away from us. And thankfully, for the NFL, it may look different than usual, but it's been business as usual. NFL free agency comes in March every single year. And we went into it wondering about what the Miami Dolphins were going to do with $100 million in cap space. Would Tom Brady go back to the New England Patriots? If not, where would Tom Brady go? We got those answers. NFL free agency was happening. Then you move to the NFL draft. And there were sensitivity questions. And, we were wondering, would the NFL draft happen? The NFL is telling you that the draft is going to happen. Well, do all they care about is money? Are they thinking about the sensitivity of the coronavirus? What's going on? Are we ready to put aside what's happening in the real world and, think about something as trivial as picking 20 and 21-year-old athletes and where they're going to play? I mean, all legitimate questions. The NFL pulled it off. And they pulled it off in a way that I think is going to be embedded in what they do in the future in the draft. It looked completely different, but in some ways it looked better. Because, instead of your usual NFL draft held at a big stadium or a big public gathering where, it was a larger than life setup and the commissioner, Roger Goodell, got booed and all the war rooms looked the same, you had humanizing going on in the sport that probably humanizes its athletes and figures less than any other sport. You know, in football, when players wear helmets, you don't necessarily understand or identify with them the way that you might identify with a basketball player or a baseball player or a golfer. But we got a chance to see the human side of things for coaches, for GMs, well, almost everybody. Jerry Jones did his draft on a 250-foot yacht. I think that proved that Jerry Jones is not human. I'm not saying that that was breaking news, but we got that kind of confirmed. But we got a chance to see Bill Belichick's house. And we're all going to remember the image of, you know, when there was a dog sitting in Bill Belichick's chair instead of him when the Patriots were on the clock. Your favorite team's coach, GM, players. How cool was it, the idea where you got to see, you know, you think about these situations and these are the most important decisions that are made, and you have these coaches and GMs that family's the last thing that's the least important to them. And instead what you're seeing is you know, the GM of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 2 kids and wife rallying around him as he's making his first round draft selection. And you saw that over and over again. And even robotic Roger Goodell had human emotion. He had wardrobe changes. He was sitting there on a Saturday in his basement of his house in New York in a t-shirt announcing who the Philadelphia Eagles 6th round selection was going to be. So we had a great NFL draft, albeit in not great circumstances. And then football turned into, and the draft turned into kind of the word that I want to wrap up, you know, my portion of before we start to take questions. And it's mirroring some of what we're feeling outside the sports world, but it's hope. You know, the NFL talks about that the draft represents hope. Your team is 1 player away from the Super Bowl. Will you be able to get that player in the draft? Miami Dolphins for 20 years have been talking about replacing Dan Marino at quarterback. Well, maybe they got that guy in Tua Tagovailoa. I practiced that pronunciation probably about 15, 20 times before going on the air. So I think I got it right, but and the hope that Dolphin fans have. And now you're starting to see sporting events that start to trickle in. You've got a major UFC event this weekend. My teammate Jordan Sherwood, who I believe is on this call, this is his national holiday because he's a huge UFC fan. Next weekend, you've got golf that's actually in our own backyard. It just announced yesterday at the Seminole Golf Club in North Palm Beach. There's a made-for-TV 4-person event. 3 of the biggest golfers in the world, Ricky Fowler, Rory McIlroy, Dustin Johnson, all with local ties, are going to play in a 4-person tournament. No spectators, no caddies, just them. And then you have actual golf tournaments that may start as early as June. You will get the 3 biggest U.S. tournaments, the Masters, the PGA Championship, the U.S. Open, all slated to happen later this year. The NBA on Friday, depending on what state you live in, has the option of opening up its practice facilities. The Miami Heat have already gotten the go-ahead from the city of Miami government to open up their practice facilities. They're talking about not just will they be able to end the season, but how they'll be able to end the season. Baseball contingency plans, you know, in June, July opening. The possibility of baseball games being held at spring training facilities. We got 3 in our own backyard. We got 1 in West Palm. We got 1 in Jupiter. We got 1 in Port St. Lucie. We don't know for sure if there's going to be college football or high school football, or as much as the NFL is saying they're planning on a season and they're going to release their schedule later this week. You know, we don't know for sure how it's going to look. But we know there is a strong possibility, there is a hope of football happening. And as much as these couple of months from a sports fan standpoint may not have been ideal, they may have flat out sucked for you. Just think about the idea on a Thursday night in November, and you're thinking about what sporting event I want to watch. And man, you've got choices. You got college football on Thursday night. You've got the NFL Thursday night football game. You've got game 5 of the World Series, game 2 of the NBA Finals, the first round highlights of the Masters, all of that in one night. Thank God for smart devices, by the way, so you can, not have to pick and choose. Also, a test if you're, how understanding your spouse is for many of you. You might have that way. You might have to make choices, or just thank your spouse if they're not as big of a sports fan as you are. So you got all that on the horizon, but hope doesn't mean that there won't be change. There may be a long time before fans are in the stands. I mean, there may be a long time before you see a basketball game in a 20,000 seat arena. It might be in an enclosed practice facility. You may have a football game, an NFL game being played at a high school football stadium with no fans instead of a 50,000 seat stadium. And these are decisions that are going to be made, local, state, national lawmakers, university presidents, commissioners, players, coaches. Most importantly, you and your comfort level and your individual choice on when you want to attend games. But there's the hope that there will be sports, and sports in a completely unprecedented time. And how many times have you heard those words? We're living in an unprecedented time. And they have that negative connotation. Well, this might be the opposite. This may be a positive connotation of sports in an unprecedented time. If you're looking at a 3 to 6 month period where you've got, every major sporting event going on. So in closing, while the sports world, like the real world, has changed, is changing, and will continue to change, it's nice to have hope. It's always nice to relive some nostalgia. And damn it, no one's going to take football from our hands. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Appreciate that. We are going to take some questions. So if you want to raise your hand virtually, there's a participants button. Click on that and then hit raise hand, and then we'll call on you. So it has to take a second to find that. Let's see here. Let's go with Adam Slotnick.
Hi, thank you.
Hi, Adam.
Thanks for the discussion, Jeremy. I don't want to not to be pessimistic, but ESPN had an article, I think a few days ago, about how the economic impact so far has been about, I think, $13 billion, and how if there's no NFL or NCAA season this fall, it would double. But looking at another situation, like you mentioned earlier, like with Gortat, what happens with the next Gortat? What happens when a player, whether it's in the NBA or MLB, and I understand it's hard to deal with what ifs, but what are the leagues, what are they putting into place right now? If a player tests positive, what's going to happen? Are the sports going to shut down the leagues again? What are they looking to do to address this?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, Adam. And I think, in some ways, sports kind of mirrors society in terms of everybody has to make that decision of weighing health, versus finances in terms of, when certain things in the country is going to open. I think from a sports standpoint, it's going to be different for each sport. So for example, if I take the NFL versus college football, with the NFL, you have professional franchises, you have, probably more access to testing. You have, things that are more sanctioned, less cooks in the kitchen. And, you can probably get 32 owners on the same page easier than you can get 128 Division I schools and university presidents, where, and I'm not saying one is more important than the other. With schools, you've got to, school presidents are thinking about, well, if we're going to open up athletics, then what does that mean for academics? And, people that are closer to the situation than I am say that you're not going to be able to hold sporting events until universities are open. So you've got, that coming into play. You've got, the fact that, you've got student athletes that are younger that are not getting compensation and, other than scholarships and, certainly not like they are in the NFL. So, there is that possibility, for example, first off, that you might see, an NFL come back before college football. Now, I think the hypothetical situation, what happens if you open up and then somebody, becomes the next Rudy Gobert and test positive? I mean, that's the nightmare situation that everybody that's involved in this decision from a sports standpoint has in the back of their head. And that's where they have to weigh, for the right reasons, which I think probably are health, and for the economic reasons, which, I'm not saying aren't the right reasons, but obviously, are in the background compared to health. How much do those weigh in? And, what happens if all of a sudden we have somebody test positive? I can tell you, if somebody tests positive and you've got basketball open up or baseball opening up for a couple of weeks, then we're going to see the same thing that we saw in March. It's not going to be a situation where, it's all right, business as usual. We're just going to ignore that positive test. Sports are going to have to shut down again. Now, the length may be different. There might be, greater access to testing. Where we were, where we are now from just a knowledge of the vaccine or knowledge of the virus and the pandemic compared to where we were a couple of months ago, there may be ways to combat it quicker. But I mean, the second that you have another positive test in an active sport, I would expect the same domino effect to happen, where that sport shuts down temporarily and then other sports follow.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? No other questions? Okay, I'm going to kick this over to Jeffrey Bavarnik. Jeffrey, okay.
Go ahead.
Jeffrey? Jeff, are you ready?
He doesn't have audio on his end. He could hear us, but we cannot hear him.
Okay, excellent. All right.
Shit.
Okay, before I end it, I have one last question for Jeremy. why would they go to spring training facilities instead of their regular places that they play at?
Yeah, so I think the thinking behind there is, I think there's two factors. There's proximity and there's the size of the stadiums. So, for example, one of the possibilities that was thrown out was having at least all of the spring training teams that train in Arizona play in Arizona. And if you've been to spring training in Arizona, you've got 15 to 20 ballparks that are all within a 30-mile radius. So it cuts out travel. You don't have to fly, you know, and certain risks are, you know, mitigated. And, you know, whether you have 30 teams in Arizona or, you know, even one model that's gained some steam, which are 3 10-team divisions all kind of playing in one centralized location. You know, I think it's keeping everybody in the same location as much as possible. You know, the other part of it too is because these games are going to be played, you know, without fans for a while, the smaller your facility is, the fewer, you know, some of the people that we don't think about, the game operations, the ushers, you know, the support staff, you won't require as many of them, you know, as you would in terms of maintenance if you were going to use your, you know, 50,000 seat ballpark.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Well, I'm going to say thank you so much, Jeremy, for coming on and giving us an update and sharing your perspective on how COVID-19 is affecting the wide world of sports. And thank everyone else for being on this call as well. Look for your email with additional meaningful ways to connect with our federation and our Jewish community during these unprecedented times. Together with our caring community, we heal, we help, and we give. Stay safe and be well.